Good morning, everyone, and happy Friday, and welcome to the 2021 edition of our series, Fintech Fridays, brought to you by BDO Australia. My name is Tim Aman. For those that don't know me, I'm the BDO's global fintech leader, as well as our national financial services leader here in Australia. It's a great day. It's partly because, one, it's Friday. Two, I think as everyone probably knows, Sydney's come out of lockdown. It's been Freedom Week. For all the double vaxxed people, please return to the office. We're paying rent, so that would be good if you come in. And then finally, probably what puts me in the best mood is I'm leading the family football tipping competition. So it always puts me in a great mood on a Friday when I'm in the lead, ahead of my sister, my father, and my 18-year-old son. So that puts me in a great mood. Today, we're going to be talking a little bit about artificial intelligence and specifically how AI pertains to the world of fintech and financial services. We've got two great people on the call. I'll introduce Michael and Schalk in a little bit, but both of these guys have a lot of great experience working with AI and technology. Before we start, there's a housekeeping slide that's on your screen, and just a few quick points. We'll be taking questions throughout the session, so if you have one, just please type that in. If you have any technical difficulties, there's a tab at the bottom where you can click. Hopefully no one's having that. And post the session, we'll send around contact details for all of us, the slides. We've got about 5 or 6 slides that we're going to be circulating, a link to the session. And if you want to look back at any past FinTech Fridays, there'll be a link where you can do so, and you'll have the contact details for all of us. So hopefully you'll enjoy the session. Artificial intelligence is expected to contribute more than about $20 trillion to the global economy by 2030. So clearly this is an emerging technology and has a major impact in the fintech and financial services sector. For fintechs, we're starting to see people use this particular power within AI to improve efficiency, precision, scalability, and personalization, all with the data being at the heart of AI. And specifically, in Australia, there's a huge digital transformation that's been occurring, and the financial services sector clearly has the most data. So we're really going to see it's a great opportunity for fintechs and artificial intelligence to thrive down here in Australia and from a global perspective. So today we want to talk a little bit about how do fintechs responsibly leverage all this data in artificial intelligence, some of the technology that's being used, and what are some of the risks and pitfalls that companies need to be aware of. Luckily, I'm joined today by two people that are really focused on artificial intelligence. One is Michael, who I hope to meet in person when I'm in California in February for the Super Bowl, when my team makes it, the Buffalo Bills. Michael Bottala, he's the Director of Strategic Insights at Mindbridge. Mindbridge is a provider of the world's leading risk discovery platform for financial integrity. The platform leverages advanced machine learning and AI techniques to augment human capacity, and also helps companies cope with the enormous amounts of data sets that they have within their organization. Welcome, Michael. I'm also joined by Schalk Kock. He's one of our partners in our digital and technology advisory team based in the most locked down city in the world. He described himself as, for those that don't know, that's Melbourne, Australia. He's one of our partners down there, and he has over 25 years of experience assisting clients in technology and digital strategy and transformation, as well as data and data governance, project advisory skills, and cybersecurity. So welcome both, and I hope you enjoy participating today.
Thank you, Tim.
So why don't we kick things off, Michael? Maybe if you can give us a brief overview of what AI is and what types of technologies are you seeing coming under the umbrella of AI?
Yeah, that's a great question to start it off. So to really simplify the concept of AI, it's teaching a computer to do smart things, and not only teaching it to do smart things, but teaching it to do things in a human-centric manner. So there's various different ways that this kind of manifests itself in today's world, including natural language processing, machine learning, neural networks, fuzzy logic, and also RPA or robotics. So, in terms of artificial intelligence, it's been around for a while, and you may or may not have realized it. If you think about using Siri on your phone, just logging into your phone, facial recognition, typing something into your phone for autocorrect, using Google to drive, and it's telling you where you want to go before you even got in the car. These are different forms of machine learning and learning kind of patterns of human behavior. And a lot of these concepts are now making its way into the fintech world. monitoring your credit cards for fraudulent activity, understanding kind of profiles of different individuals as it relates to credit card packages or different mortgage packages that fit your credit score and the different parameters you have as from a personal finance perspective. So AI is here. It's been here for a number of years, and the capabilities just continue to expand, and we're starting to see it really take over from a business perspective now.
Yeah, and I think, Michael, I think part of the, when we had our session earlier this week, we talked a little bit about, bringing to life some of the examples, everyday examples, and hopefully over the next hour, the both of you will be able to sort of highlight that, because it's probably a lot more here than what people sort of realize when they hear that word AI. It's happening sort of in the background. I guess, Schalk, from your perspective, what sort of key piece of technology are you seeing transform the financial services landscape, and kind of what are some of the key issues that they're looking to solve?
Tim, look, great question. Look, technology is, as you know, sort of driving a lot of what's happening in Australia in particular at the moment. I think Michael's touched on the IA component or AI component, but there's a couple of others that we've seen. I mean, digital just in general, to start off with, has really simplified life for a lot of us nowadays. You've got literally your bank or your superannuation fund in the palm of your hand, and also in your pocket to use as you see fit. That's one of them. One of the others that we see that's really taking off in Australia is robotic process automation. Really, RPA, is driving those tasks and help automate those tasks that are normally manually done, and it helps increase efficiency and effectiveness of those tasks. So it really helps, in the back office, in some cases, to do some of those iterative manual tasks that requires processing. So that's perhaps another one, and maybe a last one is just to quickly touch on blockchain. We see there's a big take up of blockchain. For those that don't know, blockchain is essentially the technology that sits behind the likes of Bitcoin, and that enables sort of that remote digital register, and it enables payment processing through that way. So Tim, I think that's sort of some of the technologies that we've seen. Look, I think AI is really sort of driving a lot of what's happening at the moment. So we look forward to unpacking that a little bit now in the next hour or so.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. So Maddie, maybe if you can put up a few of the slides. We've been trying to do this a little bit more in the last few FinTech Fridays, just to give people a bit of a view of, probably looking at some of these infographics on here, and they probably look at this and would be thinking, okay, well, this sort of applies to me. And this kind of alludes to what Michael and Schalk were just sort of saying, in terms of, we're starting to see technologies coming in the credit scoring space, and that's kind of like making credit decisions, and Schalk will talk a little bit more about that. It's an interesting one, because artificial intelligence can have a separate sort of fintech subsector, but then what we're starting to see is so many companies using AI. So there's a bit of a blurring of the lines between an AI company and people that are using AI. And if we look at obviously AI is helping people make better decisions, using advanced and predictive analytics, and looking at things such as automation, like Schalk sort of mentioned. So there's probably a lot of people that have been showing up at the airport back when we could travel, and all of a sudden you'd show up at the airport and you'd get a global exchange, currency exchange, in terms of, do you want to change money, etc. So people are probably tracking us and then giving us sort of emails in terms of trying to respond to a particular need wherever we are. I think some of the things we're going to touch a little bit on around credit decisions. So clearly that's an impact for fintechs and financial services, and around the risk of fraud. And then I think from a wealth management space, it's really about optimizing portfolios. So there's some of the things that are working sort of in the background as well. I guess we go to the next slide. This market map sort of highlights, from a global perspective, AI and fintech. And so again, we'll circulate these slides and you guys can take a look at that. But here within Australia, we've got 64 AI-enabled fintechs. So a good a good number of fintechs that are specifically focusing on AI. A few sessions ago, I think it was back in August, we actually had the joint CEO of Huddle Open Insurance on, and we talked a little bit about AI at that particular time. And last year, we talked a little bit about the insurance sector, really focusing on AI. Of course, this also cuts across, credit and financing, and also about some of the personal wealth solutions as well. So again, from an Australian perspective, we've got a real focus in this particular area. And as we've been talking about before, the incubator ecosystem down here in Australia is fantastic for emerging technology. So I'm looking forward to this sort of thriving over the next couple of years. If you go to the next slide here, we talk about the AI in the fintech market, and not surprisingly, like most other sectors, it's really thrived during the pandemic, just in terms of the increase in marked increase in the number of deals and in value. So you can sort of see the two main spikes were probably, from an Australian perspective, probably right around the time where we went into our two main lockdown periods, for example. So you saw in 2020 the big number of deals, and basically there was about a 95% year-on-year increase in sort of the funding growth over the past 2 years. If you look at the next slide, this looks at sort of AI deal activity over the last 5 years. And again, if you look at the current year, you can see the number of deals has gone down, probably the lowest in a while, but the value size is up. So again, this is probably a bit more of a mature sector in terms of, I think people really bought into that the technology really can help people improve processes and efficiency and better decisions. And this is sort of, you can see this by the size of the value of deals. The next slide, talks about, even if, we're looking at kind of the deal share by stage, and you can kind of see again in 2021, AI is a bit more mature just by the type of funding that we're starting to get in that E&D stage. And you're starting to see sort of that seed angel investor really being quite well, as you can see in 2021. The last slide really looks at where we're starting to see deals by geography, and probably not surprisingly, Michael sort of alluded to, and he'll talk a little bit about more. He's based in the U.S. Obviously, the U.S. is a major driver of AI. Secondly is the United Kingdom, and I guess putting a little bit more of an Asia Pacific lens. In Singapore, they've had about 3% of deals. So we're starting to see a bit more activity down here in the Asia Pacific region. Guys, any particular comments on anything surprise you from those slides? Michael, I'll start maybe with you.
Yeah, so I believe it was slide 4 that talked about deal volume, and it showed that 2017 had the most deal volume. And I found that interesting because it really set us up well for this acceleration during COVID, right? All these companies had the investment, they were scaling, and then, COVID lockdown occurred and accelerated the digital transformation from a more mature company perspective. So I think that just the timing of everything is why we're seeing AI is so prevalent now. And there's a lot more adoption out there. And obviously, we'll cover some of that later on today.
Yeah. Schalk, anything that jumps out for you?
Yeah, Tim, look, I mean, the last slide there that sort of spoke about the majority of AI happening in the US and in the UK is, as you said, is probably not surprising, but there's a lot of research out that seems to suggest that, in the APAC region, we're actually growing very, very fast in this domain. So, it's perhaps not shown or indicated on that particular slide, but it is generally sort of acknowledged that a lot of the future development is going to come and happen in sort of the APAC region. So just thought I'd add that on.
Yeah, and I think I think in the global ratings of countries and cities, we're starting to see sort of Asia Pacific find a bit of a role. Obviously, Australia is sort of in the top 10, and Singapore is as well. And obviously, it'd be great to see another country within the Asia Pacific region start to move up the rankings. So hopefully, we'll start to see that over the next couple of years. Why don't we move now to a little bit about sort of AI use cases in fintech, and we've kind of touched on this a little bit, but AI has really been described as the future of finance, and obviously partly because of the data that's already within financial services. And I think this sort of links in a little bit with open banking, which we've touched on some other sessions as well. and the transactional volume just grows every single day. And so, Michael, you might not be aware, but obviously there's an open banking regime down here in Australia, similar to the UK, and it's really about opening the access of sharing information, which then probably puts fintechs on a level playing field, or a more level playing field than some of the established big four banks. But obviously, with this transactional data, it's a high risk environment for things like cyber, and also there's the regulatory regime. So those are some of the themes that we're going to be talking about a little bit. But Michael, maybe just from your perspective, how are you seeing AI change the financial services industry?
Well, I think it really comes down to opportunity, right? There's new opportunities for revenue growth, opportunities to minimize your expenses, and opportunities to really automate the manual or tedious efforts that are taking place in these organizations. And with that, in terms of the adoption and kind of how this plays out within the organization, it really accelerates the effort. So there's actually a PwC study that talked about AI adoption plans because of COVID crisis, and it found that 52% of the companies accelerated their plans. So I just want to bring that in to kind of tie back to my previous comment about the investments. But really, AI is just becoming more of a mainstream technology, and because of that, it's obviously opening up new opportunities, and the use cases are continuing to develop, right? It's almost like if you can think it, you can do it at this point within the financial service space.
Okay. And Schalk, I guess maybe if you want to just expand on that a little bit, I guess based on your experience, you've been working with a lot of the banks here in Australia. What have you, when they start to go down an AI or digital sort of pathway, what are some of the initial thoughts that they're thinking when they're exploring this?
Well, look, when they go down a digital pathway, there's a number of aspects or things that they think about. I mean, first of all, data integrity seems to be a big thought, or one of the key things that they seem to focus on. Obviously, data being sort of the underlying foundation on which a lot of AI capabilities are built on. That's a key aspect for them. Also when you look at the data security, I think Michael, you touched on security previously. Obviously, that with cyber being such a big issue globally, really, there's a lot of sort of focus on that, and also how AI can help secure and authenticate users, as a mechanism to help drive that. And then the last thing perhaps is, how can they leverage AI from a decision support point of view? So really help drive that rich customer experience, that sort of, leverage insights to really help, build that trust and build that relationship with their customers. So that's really sort of, I'd almost say, a few thoughts around what we generally see they think about when they go down this path.
Yeah, it's quite interesting because, again, the bigger banks have just enormous amounts of data, and traditionally have a lot of legacy systems, which sometimes don't have the best data integrity. So it's sort of, we'll touch about that a little bit, but that's probably one of the major challenges with probably the incumbents. And obviously you've got fintechs that can provide, kind of a solution. I guess if we put a fintech lens on it, Schalk, I guess, where do you think some of the key opportunities are, for fintechs, to use AI when they're trying to develop products?
Look, I think in many ways it's sort of the same sort of concepts that we just spoken about, but I think there's a couple of others. I mean, I've recently worked with one of the fintechs here, and they're looking at specifically things like advanced analytics, for example, as a key capability. And again, it comes back to things like, how can we use analytics to drive that better experience, or how can we hone our product set and make our product set more specific to our customer, so that that will appeal to them in a better way. So that's one of the key things we've seen. There's a lot of focus, or there seems to be a fair bit of focus on you know, how we can also incorporate decision support capability, especially when you start looking at, you know, credit scoring and that sort of thing, especially in the buy now, pay later sort of space. You know, there's a lot of opportunities there. I know this is not a fintech example, but I know, for example, in that decision support case, one of our major banks recently sort of implemented a solution. I think it was called BillSense, which was really, I mean, from an AI perspective, really interesting, because the solution itself really looks at, for example, your bill payment history. And then see how you've paid your bills and what was sort of the value of those bills that came in, and then try and predict in future, you know, what are the likelihood or what are those amounts going to be that you need to make provision for your bill payments, and then help the customer in that way to actually prepare for that. So there's just that's just a few sort of examples of what we've seen and what also seems to work in sort of more the fintech space.
Yeah, and I think, you know, again, to me, there's always a bit of a blurring, because it's kind of the technology, and it can be either you've got a fintech that's developing that technology and trying to use that, you know, sell that, you know, particular service, or you've got financial, you know, incumbents trying to think about how they can partner with the fintech to solve a particular issue. So I think that's, you know, there's a, you know, I think the examples are relevant, because, you know, it's that same sort of thought process that companies go through in terms of, can you leverage AI to help you make a better decision? And ultimately, it comes down to the data as well, you know, because, you know, data and analytics, everyone likes to throw that around, and things like AI, but, you know, data is only as good as how you interpret the data. So I think that's, you know, that's ultimately going to be, you know, people that really thrive in this sector are going to be people that can understand the data and apply that to a product better than someone else. So that's going to be the interesting part in this space. Michael, I guess, you know, as the world becomes a bit more open, you know, in terms of open finance, where do you think there's going to be some of the main opportunities for AI in this space?
Yeah, so I think it kind of ties back to the customer perspective. Well, I think there's actually two different perspectives, right? There's kind of the internal perspective within the organization and how they're operating, and then the external perspective on how it's impacting their customers. So internally, I think there's the opportunity to identify inefficiencies and correct those inefficiencies, you know, better compliance and better overall insights as it relates to risk within the organization. And this also leads to kind of influencing stakeholders. And if there's this better monitoring, this better compliance, it's going to lead to more trust in the financial system as well, and more transparency. And then I alluded to kind of the external perspective. So impacting those customers, I think, is a big opportunity as well. You know, developing these relationships and making a more cohesive and integrated like personal finance function for individuals, right? Having everything connected where you have a very unique perspective of your personal situation, and everything is geared towards your situation. So I think we see AI it allows you to kind of narrow the scope of what you're looking at, and in a world with so much information, we need to, you know, kind of dig into a little bit, you know, kind of clean out the clutter and focus on what's relevant to us at times from a customer perspective.
Yeah. Well, that's, you know, that kind of leads in a little bit to kind of the next sort of question. Maybe you can just give us a bit of an overview of Mindbridge and kind of what the company is working on with some of their clients.
Yeah, sounds good. So, you know, just for a little bit of background, Mindbridge was founded in 2015. We launched our first commercial product in 2017. And since then, we've been working closely with external accounting firms, as well as some large enterprises on the internal audit side, and specific use cases and custom app builds. At this point in time, we've worked with over 20,000 financial professionals globally. So we've had a pretty good impact, and through those 20,000 financial professionals, we've analyzed over 30 billion data points. So talking about that data element and AI, there's really, those two are correlated very closely. One of the key achievements of this year is Forbes named us a top 50 company to watch in 2021 for AI capabilities, and we're pretty proud of that achievement. In terms of what our company does, well, what we do is we leverage artificial intelligence and machine learning to help tackle the challenges of big data. We take in ledgers, basically transactional detail, to analyze the transactions that are coming through to offer a risk perspective on how these transactions impact the financial statements. So what we're really trying to do is increase the level of assurance around financial statements, identify anomalies, and reduce the amount of fraud that's out there, to increase, financial reliance and public perception around financial statements. So at the end of the day, our goal is to really provide visibility and give everybody the opportunity to understand the underlying data in their organization.
Okay, well. Congratulations on the Forbes. That's a great honor to be top 50. So well done to you. I know it's probably not just you, but to your company. I guess so how do you convince companies to go down this particular path? If you overlay, everyone wants to give customers a better experience, but on the other side, there's privacy concerns and I guess that trust in technology. So I guess what are some of the things that Mindbridge does to alleviate some of those concerns?
Well, there's a number of different things. One is the security component. So Mindbridge goes through the SOC 2 Type 2 audit on a yearly basis to help give confidence in terms of how we approach the security within our platform. The other thing that we've done that's pretty unique is our algorithm validation. So we've actually had our algorithms validated by a third independent party to make sure that they're operating the way they're intended to. With AI, there's always the kind of issue of it being a black box and not really understanding what's happening underneath it. And I think a big part of that is, and what we've tried to do is build credibility around our system by taking these third-party audits and incorporating them from a security and an algorithm perspective to help build that confidence and trust in our software.
Okay. And I guess, putting the fintech lens on it, I guess where do you think are the most promising AI capabilities for the fintech sector?
Yeah, that's a difficult question to answer because there's obviously a lot of different ways that you could take this. In terms of kind of the fintech sector, what's the most promising? Well, I think really what I would like to see is kind of a wider open API, because there's a lot of different data sources and a lot of unique use cases, but the more that these become connected, that's when you're going to start getting into a cross analysis and really get some interesting insights out. So, in terms of capabilities, that's some of the exciting things that I see ahead is everything's becoming more integrated and more cohesive across platforms, which is going to, add to the insights and the visibility to allow professionals like ourselves to use this information and make better judgments on how to interpret and leverage that information within organizations.
And Schalk, I guess, what's your view on that in terms of, if you had to pick, what would be some of the key emerging capabilities coming out of AI that fintechs can leverage?
Oh, look, I think adding on to what he said, there's some real good capability in the speech recognition space. I think when you start looking at, I think, Michael, you touched on, voice assistants and, voice assist capability on the mobile phone. But, over here, there's a lot of experimentation that's being done with leveraging voice recognition, for example, to authenticate customers when they dial into a contact center, for example, or dial into a service desk or a help desk capability. So I think that's probably one. And then if you start looking, if you go over to the sort of buy now, pay later space, in that RegTech environment, there's a lot of opportunity to leverage AI to open transparency and look at, how do we reduce fraud and, also, ensure that, people that we actually, or customers that we actually deal with can actually pay the bills or the debt that they incur. So do that sort of background checking and validation across, your customer base. So I think there's some really good capability in that space. I think, the other one that I'm aware of that a lot of them are looking at the moment is natural language processing, especially as it relates to cyber, and looking at email filtering. I know there's some software that a lot of them are looking at that sort of are increasingly using AI capability to scan emails and do the email filtering from a cyber point of view. And I think that's there's some really good developments that's happening, obviously due to the increased sort of cyber attacks that we're seeing specifically here in Australia, but I'm sure globally as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting one, because obviously some of my broker dealer clients are trying to use that technology, because you're starting to see people popping up all over the world doing broker dealer services. And I guess as we become more and more global, that AML and that verification of who you guys are is becoming more and more important. So I think that's going to be I think something that's going to really take off over the next couple of years. I guess, Michael, when someone starts coming back to starting the journey of using AI, you talked a little bit about data, and I guess the data completeness. Maybe you can talk through how someone sort of kicks this off, because we sort of alluded to, if your data is not any good, how can you start to leverage AI? So I guess some initial thoughts in terms of what companies need to do to kickstart the project.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it kind of goes back to that old adage: garbage data in, garbage data out, right? So, the very first thing I would say is you need to develop a strong data strategy and understand your data within the organization. A lot of times there's a lot of data to be used, and it's about understanding where it's at and how to gather it in a usable format to leverage it. So developing a data strategy is a really strong piece of it. The other piece of it is change management within the organization. So McKinsey & Company talked about in their article back in April how winning with AI is an attitude. So it has to start at the top, and it's a change in the tone of the organization. It's not just about, hey, I've got this specific use case, there's this opportunity. It's about really just embedding it and being part of the way you think about things. And that's really, the tone within the organization as it relates to AI. It's not this kind of one-off tool that we're leveraging, but really embedding it into your processes and the way that you think about your data and the way that you think about your organization as a whole. And it really leads to this agile approach in the organization, right? And you start changing the way that you're recruiting staff. A lot of the traditional roles are going away because you want just those critical thinkers that can solve problems. So I think those are kind of the two big components: is having a strong data strategy and implementing that change management. And all that change management typically starts with leadership.
Yeah, and Schalk, I guess, if you put your projects, you work on a lot of different projects, I guess, from your perspective, how do companies sort of tackle launching AI, I guess, and following on from what Michael has sort of said?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, what we typically see, Tim, is we start off with the business strategy. So the business and technology strategy is generally sort of how we start the approach, and then thereafter go into the data strategy as such. What we see companies do is, and in fact, we've sort of a couple of years ago worked with one of the super funds, where we essentially worked with them and almost looked at their organization from the outside in. And we see that approach, that approach where you almost start with the end and goal as your starting point, quite often within the AI space, where clients sort of look at, what does that customer experience need to look like? That rich experience. How do I build that trust? What does the customer journeys look like that I need to, or that I want to enable for my customer? And how can I leverage my data set to actually help me enable that sort of journey with the customer? So that's typically sort of, where you start with a strategy. You look at sort of your customer channels or your omni-channel environment at front. Normally then we find that clients then would look at, decision support, for example. Where does the decision support layer sit that generally would support your omni-channel environment? And thereafter you would look at your technology platform architecture that supports it, and then thereafter really the operating model. How do we implement an operating model that really supports the channels and the customer products and services that we want to provide. So we find a lot in Australia, the term that's being used, new ways of working, where clients are looking at different ways of approaching and providing services that are really looking to break down those business silos and looking to provide services that are more end-to-end and streamlined based on products and services that they that sort of connects through to the customer at the back end. So that's really what we're seeing, Tim. I mean, obviously the points that Michael mentioned around change management is very important. I think there's a couple others as well around sort of executive sponsorship, which is a very key point for us as well. Obviously for a project to be successful at the end of the day, if you don't have that sponsorship right at the top, you typically are not going to get very far. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, I think the tone of the top is quite important. I think, because obviously it's easy for an executive to say, yes, we want this, but then they have to stay engaged in the process, because that's typically where things go completely pear-shaped. They might be there for the ribbon cutting ceremony, but then, walk away and then come back and say, how come this isn't done? So I think partly, if I put my FS hat on, it's partly going through a bit of a staged process, because I think also, when you work with customers and clients, they may, is trying to focus in on what they want to do, use AI first, start small, make sure that works. So if you look at some of the smaller banks here, they're talking about, automation, because, the cost, the people leverage ratio is really, really high. So how do you actually speed up the process of, doing customer applications, etc. And obviously the customer centricity, everyone's sort of, chasing that silver bullet, because you want that stickiness of, kind of a customer. And I guess, Schalk, if you look at the Royal Commission, that's been sort of on the back burner for the, during COVID a little bit, but we're going to be coming out of lockdown, and that focus on the customer is really kind of, sort of paramount for people in the FS sector to gain back the trust of the customers. I guess, how do you think AI is going to help clients win over the trust of their customers using AI? I can't.
You might be on mute there.
Sorry.
There you go.
The Royal Commission was really an interesting one, because when you look at how that played out, a lot of that centered, especially the way they approached that. There was a lot of sort of areas of threat that they kind of pointed out. I think we've spoken about poor data quality, for example, and how that was sort of created risk as such, was a big component. But I think when you look at AI has a few pitfalls in the way that it goes about and dealing with specific requirements, or specific how it deals with dealing with specific customer scenarios. So some of the things like judgment calls, for example, and understanding the context behind specific scenarios are generally sort of a challenge for the AI environment. So that's just a sort of a few thoughts around the Royal Commission and that sort of area.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to watch, because I think as companies have had a bit of time to think through, probably during sort of lockdown. It's going to be interesting to see where customers go and the financial services sector goes over the next year. I guess with and Michael, this is probably a bit more for you. In the U.S., the big tech companies moving into the FS space. How are you seeing this happen, sort of on the ground back in the States, and them leveraging AI to come into what I call traditional financial services markets?
Yeah, that's really interesting, because the first one that comes to mind is really Apple and them introducing their own credit card, right? And Apple, I've got an iPhone, and I know they know more about me than I probably know about myself. So it's very interesting that they'll also have control over some aspect of my money if I decide to go to a credit card with them. But I think that the benefit is that they lead to a lot of innovation, right? A lot of the ways that things were done in the past. I think about overdraft fees. If you're a cent over your bank balance, you owe a $20 fee. If you're 1 cent over, you owe $20, doesn't really make sense. Just how initially fees are triggered. So I think there's a lot of ways that this innovation in the model is going to change in terms of financial services because of the tech companies moving into it. I think revenue, a lot of these fee-based revenues that the traditional banks have will change because these other tech industries will have more predictive analytics, understanding, okay, they actually have direct deposit, and that should be here in a few days, where this overdraft will, not be an issue at that point. So there's going to be that element of AI in these services coming down from the tech companies, which will really change the landscape. That being said, I think there is also going to be a need for increased regulation. So, anytime you've got a tech company as large as these Apple, Google, that have so much access to your information, there's got to be a certain point in time where the customer has some sort of protection or opt-out options. So I think we'll see more in terms of regulation as they crossbreed.
Yeah, I think regulation is obviously very important. I guess, and Schalk, I guess from how do you see the Australian government sort of handling this? So every once in a while, you'll see on the front page of the Fin Review here, Google hasn't paid tax in 47 years, and those sorts of things. And obviously the tech giants just seem to be able to go ghost protocol and coming in and out of countries. So I guess, how do you think the Australian government's going to handle that sort of big move back into Australia?
That's a really good question, Tim. Look, I mean, as you were asking that question, I was actually thinking back. To news articles that we used to see back in 2008, 2007, 2008, prior to the GFC. And what was interesting there was a lot of those articles used to say, are the big banks too big to fail? Then we all know what happened with the Lehman Brothers scenario in 2008, and how that collapsed, and actually how the US dealt with that from a regulatory point of view. And I think in many ways the Australian government sort of learned from that experience, because if you see how that was applied through the Royal Commission recently, where they looked at misconduct in banking and superannuation, and also how they approach that. And then if you look at, how they've dealt with Facebook, for example, recently here in Australia, it's very clear that the Australian government's not going to stand back. The regulator is definitely sort of taking on the big tech companies. I think Facebook, as I said, was a really great example. Recently with the sort of payment for news content, where they took them on, and I know Facebook went and unfriended the Australian government after that. I think that's really been, I think that sort of sets the scene as to how the government's going to deal with these major technology companies that are coming in cross-border.
Yeah, I think, you guys touched on a few big points that I don't think we're going to solve today. One is obviously regulation and what's going to happen in this space. Two is around privacy, because obviously people have different privacy rules that opt in, opt out. You overlay open banking. So you've got these trends that are opening everything up, and then on the backside is how do we protect the customer? And so it's obviously a bit of a state of flux, and governments are trying to keep pace with some of the change. I guess from a privacy perspective, what are you seeing in this particular space? And Schalk, maybe I'll ask you this one, because from an Australian privacy perspective, kind of what are the rules to protect people, against sort of AI, I guess?
Yeah, absolutely. So Tim, look, in Australia, we've got the Privacy Act. Now, the Privacy Act of 1988 sort of is driving a lot of the behavior in this regard. Essentially following the establishment of that Privacy Act in Australia, we've defined what was known as 13 privacy principles, APPs. Now, just in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through all of those APPs right now. But I think what's interesting there is the privacy principles are all geared towards, ensuring that that the integrity of the data is maintained. I think APP 10, for example, there specifically addresses the quality of the information that's being maintained, you know, and actually, you know, almost mandates organizations to take reasonable steps to ensure that personal information that is collected is accurate and kept up to date and complete. And then I think the other one that I'd like to highlight, perhaps from a privacy principles point of view, is really the one around security. APP 11, for example, touches on security and again sort of almost presses on organizations to take reasonable steps to protect, you know, the personal information that they hold, especially against the likes of, you know, misuse, interference, loss, and unauthorized access and modification or disclosure of information in Australia. That's really it as far as the APPs are concerned. Over here also, you know, any eligible data breaches needs to be reported to the Privacy Commissioner, which in Australia, you know, is also in a way sort of almost acting as a deterrent in many ways. So yeah, I think, you know, there's some reasonable steps that the government has taken here to try and ensure privacy of information and of people's information.
Okay, and I guess, Michael, because you guys are a global organization, I guess, you know, are you starting to see different or tougher regulatory requirements when it comes to AI in some of the jurisdictions that you're operating in?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. I think, you know, AI operates like a human, right? So in a lot of ways, AI should be regulated like a human because it tries to take on that similar thought pattern. And I think we're still at the very early end of things where we're trying to see how it's impacting different areas and respond accordingly. So we're a little bit more reactive at this point. But I really think it comes down to, you know, taking and being ethical around AI is really the core of it all. And in terms of ethics, I think there's steps that we could take, like Mindbridge did with the third-party algorithm validation. You know, I'd like to, we're the only company I know of that's done that at this point. And we obviously operate in a very regulated industry with audits. You know, we're in a compliance type of situation. So I'd like to see other organizations take steps like that to really protect the public interest.
Okay, and I guess just one final question. I guess, you know, what advice would you probably give to, you know, clients when they embark on AI in terms of remaining competitive? Because there's always a bit of a trade-off in terms of taking key people offline and spending time on sort of AI, and it might take some time before that actually gets launched. You know, so I guess you talked a little bit about the strategy plan, but do you have any sort of advice in terms of, while that's happening, them remaining competitive?
Well, you know, with any technology, there's going to be ups and downs when implementing it. You know, learning any new system is going to be frustrating at times, but you have to kind of keep that end goal in mind and how this is going to, you know, benefit the organization in the long term. I think one of the things I want to kind of circle back to is just the way that you evaluate technology. I think that's a big piece of, you know, making sure that you're selecting the right vendor to set you off on the right foot. You know, looking into the way that their algorithms function, looking at how the data was you know, tested and what training data was used, so that, you know, there's no unnecessary biases built into the data that, you know, you get down this road and then you realize I didn't properly evaluate the company I'm working with, and now we're back at ground zero. So in terms of competitive advantages, you know, being an early mover is obviously one, but choosing the right vendor to work with long term is another advantage, and understanding the way that their system operates.
Yeah, I think the due diligence is very essential, you know, in this particular space. We did get a question from one of the people that's dialed in around tax analytics. I'm not sure, Michael or Schalk, have you seen any sort of AI technology that you've seen come through, you know, sort of pertaining to tax?
Tim, I can't really talk to tax analytics. We haven't really. Most of what we've seen from in the analytics space is centered around, you know, digital transformation, customer driving in that sort of environment. So not really around tax specifically.
Yeah, Michael, anything for you?
I'm kind of in the same boat here, since we're typically on the audit side. But what I have seen is there's a lot of data on the tax side in terms of those estimated payments and things like that happen in the US. Being able to have those predictive elements in terms of where the data is going to end up to make the appropriate payments and reduce fees is something that I've seen.
Yeah, and I mean, I know the ATO here is looking at this, because so my dad, who I referred to before, is who I'm beating in the football tipping comp. He's retired. He does his own tax return, and he'll send it in. But then the IRS will come back here. They already know what it should be. So we know that I'd probably say the big tax authorities are using the data in the stage of life to be able to predict, do they actually owe any money, or are they getting a particular refund? So I think that's, and if I put my sort of my global hat on, you can sort of see that it's only a matter of time before the tax authorities start to match. So I'm a dual international, so I lodge U.S. returns. So when I go through passport control, eventually they're going to say, Tim, have you lodged your 1040 or haven't you? So it's only a matter of time. Luckily, I'm up to date, so I have no issues. But I think that's where you're going to start to see probably the higher level tax authorities, from a government perspective, probably tackle analytics first, would be my sense. Schalk, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of your experience in terms of digital transformation, because you worked on lots of different projects. I guess, what are some of the key learnings that you think that fintechs can pick up from your experience when sort of implementing sort of digital transformation?
Look, I think there's a number of key learnings that we've had in the past. I mean, the first, I think, is just to start off by understanding, why are we doing this? So what is the business? What do we want to achieve by doing this? What's the business problem or the strategic goal that we want to achieve out of implementing an AI solution? Excuse me. That's sort of in the first instance. I think some of the other challenges that we have seen is that more often than not, organizations typically don't tend to go down the path of properly defining the strategic direction and set those objectives very clearly. So you find that you don't have the ability to take the team or take the organization along the journey, because there's not clear understanding with regards to the objectives. So I think that is a key aspect. I think we've spoken about executive sponsorship before. That's a key aspect to consider and think about when you go down a transformation exercise of this nature. And then I think, and I think, Tim, you may have alluded to this earlier, but what's very key is, it's funny how when you go through these digital transformation exercises, how success drives success. So it's really important that when you implement this, that you don't embark on an 18-month-long implementation program, but you try and set your approach as such that you try and implement this in short, sharp sort of bursts, where you take a piece of scope, you deliver that, you implement it, and you get almost runs on the scoreboard, in a manner of speaking, and then you move on to the next piece, and you deliver that, and you sort of continually implement the requirement. This is a really good approach that we've seen, and I think Michael, you've alluded to communications and change management earlier. I couldn't agree with you more. When you go down these sort of digital transformation projects, you can implement the best systems, the best solutions, the best processes, but ultimately, if the organization is not behind it, or if the people aren't trained properly, etc., your project won't be successful. So that's really important when you embark on these projects. So just a few thoughts, Tim.
Yeah, no, I think, and Michael, you kind of alluded to this, I guess, in terms of the workforce of the future. I guess, what type of people are you thinking are going to be coming into the AI space? Because it kind of covers multiple different facets of it in terms of change management, project management, obviously a focus on digital. But what are you starting to see as the type of people that are coming into this space back in the States?
Well, I think eventually we're all going to be impacted by AI in every industry, and really the benefits of that is everybody is going to be upskilled at that point, right? It's taking kind of the tedious efforts out and allowing you to understand the bigger picture earlier on. So if I think about from an audit perspective, when I was a young auditor, my first, second year, you're doing a lot of ticking and tying and a lot of compiling information. And with tools like Mindbridge, you're now leveling up and you're getting more insights and you're being more impactful to the organization in terms of your role in the audit. So I see, an element of critical thinking is obviously the key component there in the upskill, is being, giving people the opportunity to use your judgment, to try to interpret the data and continue to get better at interpreting it. Also, just in terms of technology, you want people that are open-minded, I think is a key thing. People who understand there's going to be frustrations in the learning process, but you stay open-minded to these new technologies are going to be, and embrace them, are the ones that are going to be in a better position long-term.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because I work with a few universities here, in Australia, and talking to, the dean of business schools, they talk about, do we need to, do we have an accounting degree? Because to your point, Michael, Joey or Johnny the junior might not be ticking and bashing everything because, a tool is going to spit out the answer, but you obviously miss out on the teaching, part of that. I guess, Schalk, from your perspective, what kind of workforce do you think is going to be coming out the next 3 to 5 years that's going to be focusing on AI?
Oh, absolutely. Look, I mean, what's interesting, Tim, is maybe just perhaps to mention is, the Australian government has been spending quite a bit of money on, trying to drive the workforce of the future. In fact, I think there was an amount, something like $24.7 million that was spent over 6 years to drive what's known as the Next Generation AI Graduates Program. So they're spending a lot of money in this space. So clearly, when you look at the next sort of workforce, there's going to be a lot of focus on data science, data sciences, which is already a key component. I think the AI graduate program is hopefully going to, result in some good capability or people coming out of that program of work. But then I think from a more sort of general sort of digital perspective, people with that digital skill and capability and problem-solving skill and capability, will also be helpful as part of the workforce going forward in future. So just that's a few sort of thoughts in that regard.
Okay, you guys are doing well. We're down to our final questions, so you've survived. So I guess, Michael, from a final perspective, what excites you most about the advancement of AI?
Gosh, in terms of, just the opportunities there, the opportunities to take on a really complex situation and simplify it for somebody, and being able to do that on a continual basis. So it gives me the opportunity as somebody who's interpreting the data to better understand what's happening around me and stop not necessarily trying to pin the tail on the donkey, as you say. So I think just the visibility, the transparency that this will bring to fintech, as well as just the world and financial data, will be really beneficial to everybody.
Thanks, Michael. And I guess, Schalk, for your last question, I guess, what advice would you give startups? Obviously we have a strong startup community here in Australia that are embarking on their AI journey.
Look, I think to summarize, Tim, some of the points we've made earlier, I think be very clear on why you want to implement this. What is the strategic objectives, the business goals that you want to achieve by implementing AI? I think we've spoken about, the fact that, I think it's good to imagine, or sort of reinvent or reimagine how you see that customer experience as being, and how you can redevelop, those channels at the front end and then implement that operating model. I think as a third component, and we haven't really spoken about that much today, but it's really to look at how do you govern your data set, because putting your controls in place to actually manage and govern your data set is similarly as important, as you focus on implementing, and ensure that the ethical aspects, but also ensure that you mitigate your risks associated with your data set. So there's a few thoughts there. I think, obviously then there's multiple things to think of. So when you embark on the journey, it's always a good idea to start off and define that sort of roadmap, the plan and the roadmap, so that there's clear objectives set and a clear journey plan that you can take people along the journey, as you implement your AI capability within the fintech startup organization.
Okay. Well, that brings us to the end of the discussion, guys. So thanks, Michael and Schalk, for your valued insights. Hopefully everyone agrees that this was a very good session. Next month is our final FinTech Friday for 2021. And it's going to be, I think, one of the best ones of the year, because we did this last year where we look back on the year that was. So we've got James Posnet, Senior Manager listening to the ASX, and Sebastian Stevens, who is our National Leader for Private Equity and a Corporate Finance Partner here at BDO. So that will be in November, and we'll talk about some of the ASX rules and looking back at sort of how hot the market was here. So looking forward to you joining in November. The details will be shared after this session. We'll send out an email to everyone. If you missed any of the previous webinars, my team will be sending out links that you can listen to those sessions for all of 2021. And before we close the session, if you guys can fill out a short feedback survey, that would be great, so we can look to improve on future FinTech sessions. So anyways, thank you for participating. Thanks, Michael and Schalk, and have a great Friday. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you.